Welcome back to Intro to Physical Anthropology. I'm your instructor, David Leitner. Today, we're going to get started talking about the Homo sapiens dispersal outside of Africa. How, when, where did they spread, a little bit about our evidence, and it's actually a very big subject, so to keep the video length down a little bit and a little more accessible, I've decided to actually split it up into two phases. So there's earlier phases of the dispersal, which include the peopling of Eurasia and Australia. And finally, the second video I'm going to make is going to detail the peopling of the Americas and the Pacific. This is by no means comprehensive. There's actually a lot that I am going to be leaving out for the sake of time, but it's a good overview, I think, of the situation. So without further ado, let's get started. So the first thing we need to understand is that for a long time there were two main models for the appearance of Homo sapiens outside of Africa. The first is sometimes called the out of Africa model, or also known as the replacement model. In that, the idea is modern humans evolved in Africa and then spread out and replaced the hominins they came into contact with elsewhere in the world. The multi-regional hypothesis, on the other hand, says that anatomically modern humans are the result of the transmission of alleles underlying the modern human phenotype, and in other words, so different alleles would develop in different regions around the world, and through gene flow, those all come together. In other words, regional variation is a reflection of a sort of continuous evolution in each region, and Homo sapiens arising out of that. Sorry, I had something in my eye there. It looks a little bit like this. So if we're talking about the replacement model, that's the out of Africa model on this chart here, it would look something like this. You'd have a localized African origin, and everywhere that Homo sapiens sort of arrive, you would see the disappearance of other species of Homo. It predicts that you should find the first Homo sapiens fossils, the oldest ones, in Africa, and more recent ones outside of Africa. You should also see the disappearance of other hominins as the Homo sapiens fossils start to show up. A lot of anatomical, behavioral, and genetic data supports this. A lot of the fossil data supports this. But with a catch, as I'll point out in a little bit. Now, the multi-regional model, on the other hand, looks a little more like this sort of lattice work of gene flow going back and forth between the different regions. It would include repeated migrations, not just one big sort of outpouring. Although, to be fair, out of Africa doesn't necessarily say that there was only one. It just sort of doesn't see multiple migrations that's necessary. It predicts that every region has a single lineage that sort of runs through from Homo erectus to the present day Homo sapiens. For the most part, this doesn't bear out when you look at the fossil evidence, because what we would expect to see are these sort of transitional forms in each region between Homo erectus and modern Homo sapiens in each region. Now, we don't see that. We see something else. Instead, we see the appearance of Homo sapiens. We see some continuity in each region, but the continuity leads to different species. So Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia, and Homo sapiens in Africa. And then we see the appearance of Homo sapiens in all of these areas over several tens of thousands of years, and then we see there's a period of overlap, and then we see the disappearance of the indigenous species that were there. However, more recent genetic evidence has shown us that those species didn't remain separate. Eurasian hominins like Neanderthals and Denisovans, and possibly some mystery hominins we don't know yet. The genetic evidence says there are some that aren't related to Neanderthal or Denisovan DNA. They intermixed, they interbred with anatomically modern humans, apparently almost as soon as we arrived. So there's a long history during these periods as the indigenous species dies out, where there's a long period of hybridization, where the two species are intermingling on a relatively regular basis. This is really interesting, right? But it leads us to a different kind of model. In other words, although there is definitely a replacement model going on here, it's kind of leaky. So in this sense, we can assume gene flow from Neanderthal and Denisovan populations to all non-African populations. We can also probably imagine there's some gene flow going on between the various non-African populations and even the African ones. Remember, just because Homo sapiens left Africa doesn't mean humans in Africa stopped evolving. All of us continued evolving. We all have traits related to the places our ancestors evolved in. That doesn't make us different subspecies, as we've discussed before. It doesn't make us different species, but it means that there have been some slight changes over time. Now, interestingly, the differences are much smaller than we would expect for a species that reproduces at our rate for this period of time, about 200,000 years. And we think that's because about maybe 100,000 years ago or so, there was an extreme bottleneck event, a genetic bottleneck, possibly triggered by the eruption of a supervolcano. And in it, we see that the genetic diversity suddenly just shrinks, possibly down to as few as 10,000 breeding individuals in the world of humans. Some people think it's even lower. Some people get that number down around 600 or 1,000. But 10,000 seems a little more reasonable in terms of a viable population. It's really interesting to think about that, because that means we were nearly wiped out. That means we nearly disappeared and never would have left Africa, never would have developed agriculture, never would have done anything. We would have just been gone. Another casualty in the ongoing conflict that is evolution, right? But we did. The message we should take from that, however, is not, yay, we survived and we're awesome, but rather, that should put us in our place, because the same thing could happen today. The same thing could happen any moment, whether it's an asteroid or wars or climate change or volcanoes. You know, we are a species at the mercy of the environment we live in. You know, now does that mean that we're looking at complete worldwide societal collapse in the next 100 years? Probably not. But we need to be aware that the world is not always going to be what it has been, and it is changing. Anyways, enough preaching. So there's definitely indications of gene flow, not just with the Neanderthals and Denisovans, but also between various groups. So there's this sort of pattern by which alleles sort of are distributed and spread out over time. But the one thing that is clear is that you have the notion of a strict replacement model where African Homo sapiens leave Africa, arrive in these places, and the indigenous hominins die out without any gene flow occurring, is just not supported anymore. It's just not. It's a much more complex picture of evolution. Okay, so what does the timing of all of this look like? Well, 200,000 years ago, I'm going to disagree with some of the numbers on this chart. I just thought it was really colorful and I liked it. The species first evolves about 200,000 years ago in Africa. So that's when we see the oldest remains that we reasonably call Homo sapiens. They evolve in Africa, like I say, for about 100 or maybe a little more than 100,000 years. And by at least 70,000 years ago, could have been sooner, we see evidence of Homo sapiens entering the Middle East. Interestingly, we see Homo sapiens enter the Middle East before we see Neanderthals. It looks like there's one incursion, maybe that's the wrong word, but one sort of wave of settlement about 80 to 100,000 years ago, and of Homo sapiens, and then they kind of disappear, and then Neanderthals come in, and then after that, by about 50,000 years, we see another wave of Homo sapiens appear in the Middle East, alongside Neanderthals, and that may be where some of the oldest admixtures appear, actually, which is really fascinating. Okay, from there, Homo sapiens make their way most likely along the coasts of Asia, although also with excursions inland, into the Indian Ocean, modern-day Indonesia, that sort of place, and eventually Papua New Guinea and Australia. We have to remember that at this time, we're still actually in the middle of a downward trend in the Ice Age of that period. So it's considerably colder than today at this point, which means that sea level, because more water is contained in ice at the poles, sea levels have dropped considerably. So there was a continuous land bridge between all of the islands at this point. And in fact, actually, it sort of formed two major land masses that we call Sunda and Sahul. What is clear is that by 45,000 years ago, we have clear anatomical evidence, fossil evidence of Homo sapiens in Australia. Homo erectus never made it that far. They didn't quite make it to Papua New Guinea, but Homo sapiens did. Okay, next comes the European wave. So from the Middle East, somewhere, this says 15 to 50,000 years. That's a weird set of numbers to throw up there. There have been multiple waves, in fact, actually, across Europe from various places. But the first appears to be not much older than about 40,000 years. Possibly 44, probably closer to 40. And this is actually at the height of the sort of Neanderthals occupation of Europe at the same time. So they're coming in at the same time. It also marks the beginning of the decline in Neanderthal populations as well. At least we think so. Very interesting. This is about the same time we start seeing widespread cave paintings and sculptures. We don't see a lot of that before now, but at about that time. Now, although some of the oldest and the most abundant examples of those are in Europe. It wasn't exclusive to Europe. And in fact, actually, the very oldest cave painting, like pictorial depiction, representative depiction of a hunt, actually appears 44,000 years ago, 45,000 years ago in Indonesia. So this is something happening species-wide around this time. We remember, what we find of the past is not a random sampling of the past. There are lots of things that go into biasing that sample. Where we look, haven't looked a ton in Indonesia for these things. What are the conditions for preservation of those things? Europe is really great because a lot of European caves tend to be cold year-round, so they preserve things very well, and generally tend to be drier. Whereas tropical caves tend to be, although cool much of the year, they tend to be a lot wetter. So there's a lot that goes into it, but it does appear that at least around this time, the entire species is sort of engaging in these new forms of creativity that we haven't seen up to that point from other hominins. Okay, so during much of this time, up to about 15,000 years ago, again, we're sort of entering a bigger and bigger ice age. This is showing a route sort of northwards here. Keep in mind, at the greatest extent of the ice age during this period, Europe from about here up is encased in a giant glacier that connects to the one that is covering most of the North American continent as well. And there's another large glacier, but smaller than that one, extending out from the Himalayas. Okay, so covering most of the mountains in this region, blocking most of the passage through there. So there were only certain times you could sort of get through, although there was passage around that quite a bit. So what you have over this period until about 15,000 years ago is the sort of progressive peopling of that area. Starting about 20,000 years ago, the cooling trend reverses and we start going into a warming trend. As that happens, new areas open up. By about 15,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had made it onto a land bridge here across the Bering Strait. So it was dry land. Again, ocean levels much lower. But the problem was, as long as it was still cold enough, there were glaciers blocking the entrance into the main area of North America. So they couldn't get much past Alaska and parts of northern British Columbia, the Yukon, that area, unless they went around. So that's kind of interesting there. And in fact, by 15,000 years, it appears there was a period of time where that started opening up, and populations that had settled in Beringia, as we call it, began to flood into the rest of North and South America very quickly. Within just a few thousand years, they've reached the tip of Argentina down here. Now that for years and years we thought that was the only way the ancestors of modern Native Americans made their way into North America. We now know, however, that there may have been a previous settlement of the Americas as well. We'll talk more about that later, but the main idea here is that somewhere between 15 and 20,000 years ago, a different group may have migrated along the coast. The coastal resources were plentiful at this time period, and could easily have supported human populations, kind of hip-hopping or hopscotching along the coast down into North America until they reached the sort of ice-free inland. As I'll get into in the later video, this does not mean that that modern Native Americans ancestors were not the first ones here. In fact, actually, they appear to be equally related to both of these populations. So, that's very important because, as I'll get into later, a lot of this research is very controversial for very important cultural reasons. Finally, the last sort of great migration occurs around 3,500 years ago as the ancestors of modern Polynesians begin to populate the Pacific Islands using incredibly complex boating technology. I'll get into that in a later video as well. Anyways, here is the sort of extent then of occupation as far as we know it from the timing and the area of the world. Overall, the fossil evidence gives us some very good indication of what is going on, but we can't rely exclusively on fossil evidence. We also have to keep in mind that genetics tells us about migrations as well, and increasingly we are looking at evidence for these genetic migrations and evidence of gene flow going on and evidence of groups of people moving from one place to another. And it's in combination with sort of genetics on modern, like contemporary humans today, and ancient DNA from the ancient anatomically modern humans. It feels weird to say ancient and modern in the same name. We are getting a better picture of these migrations. I'm going to stop there for now, and we will take up Africa and Eurasia in the next video. That said, thank you very much again, and I hope you have a great week, and take care of yourself. I'll see you soon.